Thanks very much for coming along today. As a couple of friends of the audience have reminded me, slow down my speech. Not everybody here is English. My team is based around the world, and they always tell me off. So if I start speaking too quickly, please tell me. I'll calm down. I'll just get excited. I enjoy this. I've got a job that I'm enjoying, having fun doing hackathons and taking ideas from concept through to scale. And that's what I'm here to share a few ideas with you today. Basically my experience in the last year at GSK. So what we'll be doing today, I'll speak for 30 minutes and then we've got 10 minutes of questions. Normally I'm used to a bit more interactive piece, but because of timings and everything else, it's suggested that's the best way to actually handle things because otherwise things overrun. So if we save the questions to the end. Yep. Juggling everything. Can you do the slide? Yeah. I can't juggle everything. Oh, I'll just press the button there. Yeah, you can press the button. Okay. Right. So, GSK, science-led pharma. We're heavily on the innovation piece. What's key for me is I'm actually in group commercial pharma. So I'm not going out inventing the next greatest, latest drug. We've got some fantastic people for that. I'm in the group commercial side. So I have fun dealing with products and projects around the world to do with commercial analytics. Previously, I was in banking and telcos, and 1 year and I think 16 days ago, I got brought into GSK. It's been an entertaining time. They've pulled me into a number of projects and products around the world, so that's partly what the variety that Databricks were interested in, to actually explain some of the experience for that. So, here talking about initial concept. We've kicked off before on a couple of products and projects with the initial CX board conversation. As probably many of you know from here with experience, you don't get a data science project coming from that initial conversation. It takes several conversations. For one of these, which I've picked on, I ended up standing up very much like this in front of a board group from one of the countries, explaining what data science is. And they gave me a particular issue, which unfortunately I can't go into too much detail. They said I'd be giving too much away. But they basically liked the idea, liked the concept, and then we were suggesting different ways we could go forward. Now, in pharma, it's a great place, but compared to stuff I've done before in banking and telcos, they're just getting the idea of agility. So I pushed the idea of a hackathon to them in order to actually get things going. So not everything needs to be a 6-month program. Not everything needs to be tied in to fully waterfall. I wanted to change the dynamic. I wanted to drive things forward with the group and with the executive team. And with that, that's where we're focused on getting executive buy-in. And that was key, getting the senior leadership in both business and tech to understand and get what I was putting forward, especially when we started developing out the business challenges. So, with a lot of these things, with hackathons and such like, I've crossed the divide a lot between business and tech over the last 20-odd years. Had a lot of fun doing it, but it makes it a bit more interesting. But I was keen to drive to the business that I wanted clear aims. I wanted clear perspectives from them. And so we were able to develop out, ended up being about 6 different items, which we condensed down to 4 on this one hackathon, where we had a clear sense of objective. So I wanted a decent hypothesis, and more importantly, I wanted a decent value. I wanted value-driven change. And I kept drumming it back to the business, and they were surprised that me, because I currently reside in tech, was coming to them and pushing to them that I wanted a $sign or a £, depending on the team I was dealing with, against the hypothesis who were coming back. And they were a bit surprised on that, which is entertaining from my perspective. We got the local business teams and tech involved, because too often from a global team, or even from the data science side, other people can feel a bit, well, either left behind, or why are you trying to tell me to do better? What have I been doing wrong that you're coming in that's something special? And I pitched it that I've come with a slightly different set of ideas and slightly different tool sets. Some new tools to the game, but these are the people who have been dealing with the data, and in pharma, some of the data has been around 50 years. So, key to this was doing the data prep, getting the file for a business challenge, and in the end of what we're aiming to do is develop the art of the possible. So put the information across to the teams and how we could actually develop things out. So we developed mixed teams. It was quite entertaining. We had the business owners to get them to focus on the what. So I wanted them to turn up and own the business problem. We're in a hackathon. I'm going to have 4 teams built out. I wanted the business owners solely to focus on the what, because too often they devolve straight into solution mode, trying to jump to the solution. And I was trying to change the dynamic, change the perspective, and that's why I had data scientists from some of our strategic partners, including Databricks. It was quite entertaining. We had people fly in from the US, from India, from our different strategic partners to actually come on the hackathon. It meant we were able to structure the teams and get some quite interesting cross-diverse experiences and ideas, and different libraries, different perspectives for how they could approach different problems. So we had the data scientists focused on the how. I also pulled the graduates in that we've got. We've got a good team of graduates. I got them trained up on a sort of product manager type perspective and gave them some experience in the lead up to the hackathon, so they could understand what they should be doing and capturing the why. It was keen to capture the why because then the other two could focus on, trying to get to code, trying to get to a problem solution, and they can capture, well, what would that mean? What would be the next steps? And that's key to then go forward from the hackathon, to then go forward to your MVP, because then it doesn't lose momentum. Got to have someone in the room, in each team, to help capture the why, because there's those little gems, those little points people forget as they're busy in the day, and our grads did a fantastic job. They quite enjoyed it as well. Persuaded them to do a few more things for me as well. So what tech was I using? Well, we're a Zero House. Previously, I've used Cloudera. I've had on-prem. I've had various sets in different companies. GSK just moved to Azure before I joined. We had a number of different data sources. We had different sets. So to set up for the hackathon, it was fairly easy because with Azure, don't know how many people are using it here, but because it's the cloud services, it's quite simple to actually spin up the different areas, spin up the workspace, and get the areas set up. So we had different files per challenge from the different data sets because we went back with the business teams saying, well, what's the problem you're looking to solve? Why are you looking to solve that? And what's the data sets involved? So we had not the full data set, because could kind of swamp them in data if some of the information is going back 50 years, but different sets so they could have a taster to actually build out stuff. And we had the data engineers working on that. And that prep was key to enable things on the day. We're using Databricks. Funnily enough, that's why I'm here. But that was quite useful. During the actual hackathon itself, we ended up some data engineers from India actually joining in and helping us solve a couple of problems on some of the data sets as we were actually coding. So being able to show that we can code, having the different data scientists turn up, I didn't have to care like I had to do previously with using Cloudera, what languages they wanted to write in, how they wanted to set it. So from that perspective, it was a real change, and it was an interesting change dynamic for the senior leaders when they saw that. It made life a lot easier, and sort of opened eyes about how we could actually do it and what we could actually do for it. It made it quite entertaining, actually pulling things through. So, the event itself. No, I'm going a bit quickly. On the day, we had the mixed teams. What I was keen on was to focus on people to actually try and solve the problem. Too often I've been to these sort of events, you end up with analysis paralysis. They start going into different rabbit holes and different areas. So we kept a core central team that I briefed heavily to effectively G up different teams, to go in and prod them in the right way. I set readbacks at lunchtime and end of day. Previously for other companies, I've run hot houses and run innovation areas. So I know it's hard sometimes to get people out of their comfort zones especially when they're dealing with certain problems or certain areas that they're used to, that they like explaining around, that it's almost hard to then tackle that problem, or it seems too big, too large. And we had to intercede. We had 4 different teams operating. We had some great admins sorting things out. So we had a succession of 4 rooms with the screens set up, with whiteboards, all the good admin things. I had a great admin team to take all those problems away, even for the sake of putting lunch on to stop them wandering off. Didn't want them to escape. But it's getting those people to understand that they're there to do a solution. I don't care if it's wireframe. I don't want you turning up with PowerPoint, like here. I don't want PowerPoint. I want code. I want code written. I want to see you try. I want to see you fail. And if you do fail, why? What are the issues? What are the problems? That's also a win. One of the business challenges, actually, the win was them understanding the key issues that would actually stop them resolving that. And now they're putting that in place. So that's going to turn into a data science project for me for next year. It's a meeting I was having on Friday morning, that they've taken the ideas, they've built out on the data, and now they actually want to go and attack that next year. So I think that's a fantastic win myself. And having that buy-in from the senior leadership team, having that support and their attendance, I was able to get them to follow up, agree the follow-up in advance. So having their commitment, getting that senior leader to say, right, I've got budget. If you've got a challenge is good enough, coming out to the end of this, I will put my hand in my pocket and allocate budget for a X team. So it's the usual thing. You budget a team, what would it cost? So I estimated out, okay, I could get an MVP in 3 sprints. So it was a bit of a challenge back to them because they've found it a bit different. It was a very different way of working. I'm used to doing that in other companies. I've been brought in doing consultancy. So it was quite interesting and engaging, seeing the business get quite engaged, quite enthused, because there was an actual pot of money. You know, at the end of the rainbow, there was something to actually aim at, which made it quite entertaining. Getting the business and tech working together in one room also was great for the enthusiasm. Both sides were actually quite pleased and quite surprised, as opposed to going through the normal process of everything, getting everything going through in one day. One of the learning points, of course, as usual, everybody wants more data. As usual with the hackathons, I could have done with more. We could have had a bit more time to prep in advance, prep the different teams. So they were coming from all over the place. And certainly the next one I'll run, I'll try and get those teams working together beforehand. But it was a little bit hard with them being in different companies, different time zones, different areas. The other key point was coming out with the art of the possible. Having that baseline working solution. 2 of the actual teams actually had code up and running and actually had answers up and running in front of people. The Databricks tool was great for that, being able to put the graphs up. One team went one further and utilized the designers I'd got, because we've got Power BI all over, and I just wanted to show them in a comfort point, because at the end of the day, I wanted actionable intelligence. The actionable intelligence is actionable when it gets to the people who are going to use it. In GSK, we have one device, so awful lot of these hanging around. So I wanted to get it to the point where you could theoretically turn around next day and say, here you go, use this. This will actually give you the intelligence. And I wanted to put that back to the senior leaders on both business and tech, that it didn't need to be a 6-month project. I could turn around in a day and deliver them something. All right, it's not perfect, it's a single thread, but there's that possibility. And that opened up a lot of perspectives for when we move forward to MVP and then scaling. Almost too much. Bit of a shout out for one of the Databricks people, Thunder. It was quite amusing. He pulled out a Facebook algorithm in front of some of the tech people and said, oh, we can use this, which made them smile a little bit. They weren't quite used to the idea of libraries and pulling in all the different algorithms. They thought everything had to be coded from scratch. So, successful MVP. That's great. That's half the battle, though. You go to a lot of these where you do a hothouse, a hackathon, but then nothing comes of it. Well, because we'd got the approval beforehand, because we'd got the buy-in from the business, which is always key, because we got them lined up, we were able to then go on to the MVP. The key line from this is the focus on the thread, the end-to-end thread. You've got to simplify. You've got a whole business team and tech team all G'd up from the hackathon. Great, we can do everything and everything. And you've got to almost dampen down that enthusiasm. It's great. That's lovely. That's going on the backlog. That's great. That's lovely. Is it in the MVP? No, it's going on the backlog. So constantly doing that and getting outcome focused and then saying, great, to MVP in 3 sprints. What are we going to focus on building out for then? And so we were able to then get them focused on those 3 sprints, and anything, we were pretty ruthless on it, anything that would stop us getting to the MVP at the end of those 3 sprints, I stripped out, from data sets to number of brands we were working on, to the scope. I stripped it down. I wanted a workable solution at the end of the MVP. I wanted to walk up to the senior leader involved, hand over the iPad, look, there you go, it's working. That's the bit you were saying, that's now the live data, that's now the information flowing through. And that's what we did. Great, but we had to push the team to code with the future in mind. I didn't want to cut any corners on that, because past the MVP, when you go to scale, that's going to make you win. That's going to be the real difference. So with the data ingestion, we limited the sets, but when we wrote the code, we wrote it so you could actually put the filtering in. So it didn't restrict what you were doing. When we actually put the different commands, we set it out so I know I can then repeat it in different brands, different countries, different areas, sets within GSK, because I know I've got the repeatability. With the data engineering, the way we configured the data sets and the files, we had that consistency. So even though we were working towards the MVP, I had a parallel stream to bring in the rest of the data, which would get me ahead for the scaling. So, what was the difference in the tech? This is the difference with the cloud. So we're going from the blob, dropped in CSV files, single dump, single use, to all of a sudden we're going to a pipeline thread. We're going from we've got one run through to then doing, say, well, what at this point? It was like 6,000 machine learning models a minute, trying out different things. So we're able to scale up. We got the data engineers. I'm sure a few of you are having fun with the data engineering, doing the raw, foundation, enriched, however you want to call it. Everyone seems to call it differently. But it's how you structure it in the data lake to make it easier for the different countries to utilize the information. And that was the key. Because we've got this one use case, because we got that information in, we were then pulling the other data sets, which means I can then leverage and build out the other use cases that are going to come off this as almost like a backdoor way to pull in the local information. So if I'd want to get, say, 500 sets of data from this one data source, it was just as well to pull in the rest of the 2,500 of the 3,000 total out of this one data source as it was just to pull the 500. So that set me up for when I'm scaling and when I'm building out further. So I've got a good data engineering team with that eye on the prize of how can we move to scale. So it's not stopping the process. You've got that pipeline of data engineering work, you've got that pipeline of use cases, and that future in mind, but not stopping the flow, not stopping what we're delivering for the now, for the MVP. We're using Power BI. Well, for me, I just like delivering actionable intelligence at the edge. They happen to be using that. I could have been using Tableau, could have been using any of the other tools that people prefer to use for imaging. Other projects I've done, I've built web UIs. We've structured it to go back into other systems for next best actions, different items like that. At the end of the day, because I've got the information coming in to the data lake, I'm using Databricks to do the data engineering, the data manipulation, and then I'm building out the code. I can extrapolate that, dump it into a SQL database, and populate whatever I want. I've got that flexibility. The business was surprised at that. They were expecting to then have to do another set of work, another structure of work, but we kept the flexibility there. We kept the momentum. And that's key for this stage, is keeping that momentum, that flow going. Because too often when you go into MVP, it's someone turning around, tech or business, I found, and going, can we just add one more thing? Can we just do this as well? This looks really cool. And they get all excited, but it stops you delivering. It stops you getting over that final line to actually say, great, we've delivered MVP. We've done what we set out to do. Here you go. And that gets the buy-in for the next one. So, scaling. We've delivered the MVP. Great. Everybody's happy. Woohoo, brilliant. That's the starter. That's now I'm in the frame. The hackathon showed the art of the possible. It woke them up to the possibilities. The MVP showed we could deliver on what we said we could do in the timescales that we presented at the cost that we set it. It was quite entertaining. I had teams in several countries around the world working on it together. So it felt like 24/7 coding at times. Certainly the problem calls did. It was quite entertaining putting those together and getting a similarity, or even just picking a time to do the right time for the Scrum calls, just fitting in everybody's diaries. The data ingestion, going through scaling, because we built in the right way with the MVP for a single thread, single brand, it made it a lot simpler when we were adding additional data, additional sets. So to go from a single brand to 30 brands, when we were adding on the scaling, took a week and a half afterwards, because we'd already set out the structure of the data, because we'd already set the code to consume the rest of the data. They thought, oh, it took us 6 weeks to do one brand. Is it going to take you another 6 weeks to do the next? Nope. We'd structured it. That was another surprise for both the business and tech teams, because we'd got the experience of doing elsewhere, because we'd structured the code that you could actually assume that, and because we'd got the data engineers to build it in a consistent way, we could bring the code in and then scale up fast. We know it works. We know the thread works. Let's scale up fast. That brought its own problems about increased data range, volume sets, and everything else. But that's where you go through your testing thread. So all of a sudden, the model's getting a lot more complex than that single thread. As you saw with the tech before, all of a sudden we're using Azure Data Factory as well. That's basically for automating the pipeline. So with that, we've got the structures in. Instead of a blob store and having to pull it in, we've got the data engineers putting the structure in to pull the information through. And same again, we're going back to outcomes-based backlog. So even with the scaling, where they're understanding it, we then had to be ruthless again, because it's saying, right, you're happy with the MVP, you like the MVP, let's do the same thing, but at scale. So we've delivered on that. We've got the piece live. We're about to go live with the rollout on this particular product. And from this team, we've now got multiple other products coming off it. So, summary. There's a lot of ways to actually go for this. The key bit is doing the business engagement and getting the buy-in at all levels. I was fortunate that we got great buy-in from the local levels, because quite often, you know, data science teams, they can come across a bit much for, you know, you've got a local team that maybe have been working the last 10 years doing BI. We come in thinking, oh, great, we can do this faster, easier, quicker. And it can come across a bit arrogant, to be blunt. And I wanted to ensure those teams were brought in. And I think I was very successful for that, because now they've started training and learning Python. So I kind of won them over a bit. I'm quite happy about that one. The focus on the single thread end-to-end. By doing the single thread end-to-end, that was the key win. And this is what the business related back. I'd got a new boss start about a week or so ago. And she sat down with the VP who sponsored all this. And these were his lines coming back. That ruthless focus on the end-to-end thread, that was the winner for him. The fact that we were showing that we could have that deliverable, that actionable intelligence in hand at the time that we said we could do it, was the win. I mean, everything else is a fun math exercise. It's just geeking out with data up until that point. Until you've got that actionable intelligence, there's a whole lot of so what for the business. It doesn't really matter. On the tech side, doing the code discipline meant I was able to do those jumps from the hackathon through to the MVP, through to the scaling. And ultimately, it was able to do that art of the possible. This has been the interesting bit with the art of the possible, because all of a sudden I've gone from several teams that are wanting to do this to a good dozen or so projects going across the company. across GSK, which is quite entertaining because now they've seen it, they all want to do it, they all want to come in and play and build out these different things. So it makes it quite entertaining from my perspective and quite useful from a GSK perspective because I've built out one use case. I've used that as a background to pull in the other use cases, pull in the other data sets. So it means when I go to the next use case, I've already used that as a backdoor principle to be able to get all the data and the structures and the sets. So if they say, we want you to replicate this in another area, another country, another piece, we've now got the documentation that we can go back to the business and say, right, these are the data sets, this is the profile I need, this is how we need to build it out. And it almost becomes almost a gateway for entry that I can now push back to them instead of they just pushing on us, which has been quite entertaining and quite useful because now the business leaders are turning around to their teams and getting themselves set up to help us win and help the company win. So I think I've talked enough. Try not to go too quickly, as my colleague was telling me to slow down. Any questions?
Sure.
Hi, thanks. Very interesting talk. So I just had some questions about the hackathon to begin with. You said there were 4 ideas and 2 were rejected. I was wondering, first of all, the ideas that you bring into the hackathon, is there any winnowing process before that, and how does that work? And secondly, the ideas that were rejected or selected, was that primarily based on technical feasibility, or was there any weighing in of like relative value to the business?
Good question. Working backwards, the relative value, that was how we selected. There was about 10 problems that they looked at, talking with the business, start off with. I rejected 1 because it was just too much of a, we've got this, we just want to do it faster. I wasn't interested. It just didn't, wasn't much of the art of the possible enough. It came from a very nice person in marketing. I get on very well with them, and now they understand the art of the possible, and I don't want to just do a faster spreadsheet. Thank you very much. But the others, once they understood where we were going for, that 10 got selected and subsumed down. So that was a willing, we basically did the cut down working with the teams, working with both business and tech to focus on that, saying, right, what's the value? Is this thing you really want to take forward? So that's how we got to the 4, because the 4 was about comfortable number of teams we could operate, and so a certain one drops off. And during the hackathon itself, if they'd said yes to all 4 at the end of the hackathon, I wouldn't have thought they were serious to take it forward to MVP. So I wanted them to reject 1, 2, possibly even 3, but I wanted 1 to go through. But 1 got rejected, as I said in the talk, because they thought it was too complex. They didn't quite have the data, and I considered that a win. The other one was rejected because when they looked at it, they didn't see the value. They saw the value coming in, coming out, they didn't see the value. And the 2 they took forward, they actually went, and this is part of the pitch within the actual hackathon itself, is that some of the best ones I've seen is when different ideas combined, and that's what happened with this one. They took those 2 ideas and combined them to 1 for the MVP. Does that help? Yeah.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Peter. Very interesting. A question on the hackathon as well. You mentioned multi-site, different time zone. Can you give an idea of number of teams you had and how you manage basically the multi-site aspect of it? And a question as well, is it use case driven, as you say, or is the end idea is to create a product and to productionize really the things? But first, in terms of dimension, and maybe is it also only internal to GSK or open to academia and external?
The hackathon, you're talking the hackathon or generally? The whole hackathon. Hackathon, I had 4 teams. I tried to get them all in the room. Some people couldn't, so I had some people dialing in from India and also some help from the US, which was entertaining, getting the time zone to cover it off. That was during the hackathons. The teams I've got operating now, I've got, as of an email this morning, 6 teams, but that's basically all around the world now. So it keeps us entertaining. Very different styles and different teams as well, I'm finding. So it's quite entertaining.
Thank you for sharing. I have a question about the technology selection, and if you had to deal with onboarding a technology, talking to infrastructure, security people, data sensitivity, was this ever an issue, or everything was onboarded before that?
Oh, pharma data sensitivity. It's got loads of it. PII, everything else. They haven't met a data set they'd like to be scared about. It's, you know, I thought banking was hard. So I basically had a security person sat on my shoulder going through yes, no, yes, no. And I did that up front. Instead of them coming on and saying, you can't play, I got that up front and got them to tell me what the zones of play and then be able to push it and understand it. And by getting that understanding up front, it made life a lot easier going to the hackathon and going to the other sets. With the onboarding of technology, I'd already delivered a couple of use cases with this basically technology stack, so I knew I could win with it. Joined GSK a year ago. 2 weeks in, I got thrown a project which was done by a third party. They were writing something on R. It was awful, but I got a team, and in 2 weeks I turned around. It was taking them 3 days to run 3,000 of these these cases, and after 2 weeks I was able to run 20,000 in 20 hours. When I handed that back off to the different group and handed the team off earlier this year, we were running was it 16,000 models a minute. So it's just doing that scale, because writing R, for example, you put it in Spark R, you can start breaking it down. You're not a single node. So I knew I could win with the technology. I kept it to stuff I'd won before, so I wasn't introducing anything new. Some of the new stuff I did introduce, and I got the teams to be clever about it, was some of the libraries, or maybe a new algorithm, or a new way of looking at it. There's always, you know, I can always guarantee I'm not the smartest person in the room. In GSK, it's normally the case because it's full of PhDs. It's hilarious. So it's pushing back to them, saying, well, how do you think you can win with this data? Where is the actionable point of this data? And pushing back to the business, because it's no use the VP getting the information if it's the person out in the field that actually needs it. And that's the bit that actually made it quite entertaining. Is that helpful?
Yeah, hello.
Sorry. Hi.
Thanks for sharing the experience. It's informative. I have a question. So when you're saying when you moved from MVP to productionized scalable version, so I'm sure it must be running on the production. Based on that observations on production, what are the shortcomings you have found? And when you look into the retrospect, you can tell us that you could have done certain things in a better fashion, which eventually relates to the best practices in the hackathon. So can you share that experience if you have any? If you missed out anything in that journey, which you could have done it better, so that you don't have the shortcomings what you have right now on the productionized version?
Data prep is the usual one that I've had on a couple of these, where you get surprised because you get a cut of the data, and you build out on that with those assumptions that when you get the production scale data, either the set's different, the columns are different, that spec is different. So what I've ended up doing is actually having the get data structure in one notebook and the actual algorithms and everything else in another notebook, just to simplify and separate. Because I've had too much fun with that. The other piece is been entertaining, that you go from that simple thread model to the more complex one, and the business goes, oh, that's great. It's like kiddies in a candy store. I want more, I want more. And learning to be more ruthless on that, on the production piece, and getting good at saying no, and saying, can we put it on the backlog? That's great, get it on the backlog. It almost became a mantra with the business people that they kept repeating back to me. It's got entertaining, but that's the key thing. By getting it out in production, you're going to get production questions coming back, which is the ones you want. Everything else, up until that point, is fun theory, but it's still geeking out with maths. There's no so what until it's there. Is that helpful? Sorry.
Well, we can maybe have a quick last question.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. How do you measure the business value, and what is the next step for the good traction that you created with this project?
Right. Good question. Business value, that came from the VP. The VP who owns the business and who needs to stand in front of his boss and say, what's he equating to that? Because I could make up numbers, but I'm not the person with the P&L standing behind it. They are. That's my perspective when I go into any of these use cases. I want them to actually stand up and say that, because I know the value is actually more than that, but that's what they're comfortable saying, and it's a really decent sum because it was a good area of the business. The next steps, I'm being asked to present across different regions and different countries that are now wanting to use this model, and from the back of this, they're actually asking me to do a whole set of other use cases, which we can then rotate the data for, say, different teams, different types of teams, and how we can go into different levels. So it's opened their eyes. This has been the fun bit. You've got the business people going, now we can do X. And I don't know. I have a laugh with that. I enjoy it. It's fun. I've opened their eyes. Now it's almost like Pandora's box. I've got to almost like go, okay, let's just make sure we deliver this first before we jump to the next one. Is that helpful? One more? Got 25 more seconds.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the talk. So my question is, we're also working with pharmaceutical companies, and they are, sometimes there is a pushback against more agile approaches, because historically, especially in research and development and manufacturing, they used to be very, very slow compared to these more. So do you had any pushback on this kind of more agile approach to projects, or how could you turn that around if you had?
Yeah, basically some of the people who'd been in one of the products I was doing, not the hackathon, in another area, they kept reverting back to the same language about waterfall and everything else, and they kept wanting that long-term plan when I was running sprints. So I just had to win by showing and delivering and showing and delivering. That's the way I got through, and then getting the senior management buy-in to get them to understand it meant I was able to remove different obstacles. It's not going to be the best thing for every group in pharma, because certain groups you've got to go through that process because of the sign-offs and everything else. It's a simple fact. It's regulation. There are ways around it. I know certain things that I've done before in both banking and telcos are regulated, and there's different ways you can do it with that agile and sprint approach. But ultimately, it was very entertaining. Getting them on board, it wasn't easy. It never is. I think this is the 5th company I've gone in where they've kicked off Agile. I've delivered it in 2, and they've been different every time. It's getting the people on board and getting the people behind it.
Thanks.
Pleasure. Hopefully you enjoy it yourself.
Thank you, everybody. If you have more questions for Peter, you can still ask him, I guess, back in the room. Remember to rate the session. If you like the presentation of Peter, please rate it in the app, the Spark Summit app, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.